The CEO of a company with 4,000 employees walked across the room at my father-in-law's own charity gala, and he bowed, and I do not mean he nodded. I mean he bowed the way people bow when they are in the presence of someone whose opinion of them genuinely matters. And the person he bowed to was my husband, David, who was standing near the entrance in a dark jacket holding a glass of water, and my father-in-law Lawrence was standing 3 feet away and had spent the previous 4 hours introducing David to every person at that gala. As my daughter's husband, he works in building maintenance, and Lawrence watched the CEO bow, and Lawrence's face did something I had been waiting 3 years to see, which was that it lost its certainty completely. And the CEO said, "David, I didn't know you'd be here tonight." And my husband said, "Hello, Richard." And the CEO said, "Your family's foundation is the reason this organization exists. You know that?" And my husband said, "Richard, you did the work," and the CEO said, "We did it because of you." And Lawrence was holding a champagne flute, and he did not drink from it for a very long time. And I stood next to my husband, and I did not say a single word because David had asked me not to, and because watching Lawrence understand something in real time without any help from me was the most satisfying thing I had experienced in 3 years of Sunday dinners. Okay, so hi everyone, welcome back, and truly if this is the first video you've ever clicked on from this channel, then congratulations on your taste, because this one has been living in my chest for 3 years, and I am so ready to put it down. My name is Maya Okafor, and I am 32 years old, and I married David Okafor 4 years ago. And David is the facilities manager at a mid-size office building downtown, and he has been doing that work for 9 years, and he is genuinely excellent at it, and he finds it meaningful, and he is good with his hands and good with people, and good at solving problems quietly and without drama. And I fell in love with him at 26 because he was the most grounded person I had ever met, and because he made me feel like the room got quieter and better when he walked into it. And my father-in-law Lawrence found none of these qualities impressive because Lawrence is a man who measures people in a very specific way, which is by their title and their income and their visibility. And David's title was facilities manager, and Lawrence's title was founder of a commercial real estate firm. And Lawrence had decided within the first dinner that David was beneath the family, and he had been making that decision audible ever since in the specific way that wealthy fathers make decisions audible, which is through the careful architecture of small comments. And Lawrence's small comments sounded like this. At our first family Christmas, he had introduced David to his business partner as Maya's husband. He keeps things running at an office building, and his business partner had said, "Oh, that's useful." And Lawrence had said every building needs one, and David had smiled and passed the roast potatoes. And at our second anniversary dinner, Lawrence had asked David if he had ever considered going back to school, and David had said, "For what?" And Lawrence had said something more professional, and David had said, "I'm a professional, Lawrence." And Lawrence had said, of course, and changed the subject, and at a family birthday. The previous spring, Lawrence had told his brother that Maya married for love, which was said in the tone of someone describing a charming but impractical decision. And I had heard it from the next room, and I had gone into the kitchen, and I had stood at the sink for 3 minutes, and then I had gone back to the table and smiled. And David had looked at me, and I had shaken my head slightly, and he had nodded, and we had driven home, and he had said, "Lawrence is who he is." And I had said, "I know," and he had said, "It doesn't touch me," and I had said, "I know," and I had believed him, and I had also been keeping a very quiet record. What Lawrence did not know about David, and what David had specifically asked me never to volunteer, was the full picture of who David's family was, and the picture was this. David's grandfather had immigrated with very little and had built a construction company over 40 years, and when he died, he had left the company to David's father, and when David's father died 8 years ago, he had left the company to David and David's 2 sisters, and the company was not large by the standards of Lawrence's world, but it was real, and it was debt-free, and it had 40 employees, and David had chosen not to run it operationally, because his sisters were better suited to that, and because David genuinely wanted to do the work he was doing, which was facilities management, which he had chosen and not fallen into. And the company paid David a share of its annual returns, which was comfortable, and which David did not spend extravagantly, and which Lawrence had no idea existed. And beyond the company there was the foundation which David's father had established 20 years ago, and which supported workforce development programs in the city, and which had funded 3 organizations that were now significant. And one of those organizations was the charity that Lawrence had chosen to support this year with his gala. And David had known this for 6 months, And David had said to me in our kitchen 6 months ago, should we go to Lawrence's gala this year? And I had said, do you want to? And he had said, I think it would be interesting. And I had looked at my husband, and I had said, David, do you know something? I don't know. And he had smiled in the specific way. He smiles when he knows exactly what he knows. And he had said, let's just go to the gala, Maya, and I had said, okay, and I had bought a dress. The gala was at a hotel ballroom, and Lawrence had organized it with the specific thoroughness of a man who wanted to be seen organizing it. And there were 400 people and a silent auction and a string quartet. And Lawrence had spent the cocktail hour walking David around the room and introducing him to people as my daughter's husband. He's in building maintenance, and David had shaken every hand and remembered every name and said exactly the right thing to each person. And I had watched my husband work a room full of people who had been primed to underestimate him, and I had thought about the kitchen conversation 6 months ago, and I had waited. And at 8:15, the CEO of the organization Lawrence was supporting arrived. And his name was Richard Callahan, and he was the kind of man who entered rooms with intention, and he scanned the ballroom the way people scan rooms when they are looking for someone specific. And he found David near the entrance, and he crossed the room. And he bowed and he said, David, I didn't know you'd be here tonight. And the string quartet was between pieces, and the room was momentarily quiet, and Richard's voice carried, and Lawrence was 3 feet away and heard every word. And David said, hello, Richard. And Richard said, your family's foundation is the reason this organization exists. And David said, Richard, you did the work. And Richard said, we did it because of you. And then Richard said, I want to introduce you to some people tonight if you're willing. And David said, of course. And Richard took David across the room and introduced him to 4 people in succession. And with each introduction, he said, this is David Okafor. His family's foundation has been funding workforce development in this city for 20 years, and each person shook David's hand with a different quality of attention than the one Lawrence had produced all evening. And Lawrence stood where he had been standing, and his champagne flute stayed full. And I stood next to where Lawrence was standing, and I watched his face recalibrate in real time, and I did not help it along. And I did not say anything, and I did not look at Lawrence directly. I just watched my husband move through the room with the easy confidence of a man who has always known exactly who he is. On the drive home, David said, how do you think that went? And I said, I think Lawrence learned something tonight. And David said, I hope it wasn't too much at once. And I said, David, you have been introduced as the maintenance guy at every family event for 3 years. And he said, I know. And I said, was this the plan the whole time? And he said, I knew Richard would be there, and I knew Richard would recognize me. And I said, and you let Lawrence introduce you around all evening first. And David said, context matters, Maya. And I said, David Okafor. And he said, what? And I said, you are the most patient person I have ever met in my life. And he laughed and I laughed. And 2 days later, Lawrence called and he said, David, I owe you a conversation. And David said, come to Sunday lunch. Lawrence came and he sat at our table and he said, I didn't know about the foundation. And David said, I know. And Lawrence said, why didn't you tell me? And David said, you didn't ask Lawrence, and the table was quiet. And Lawrence said, I owe you an apology. And David said, I appreciate that. And then David served the food, and they talked for 3 hours. And it was the first real conversation Lawrence and David had ever had. And it happened because a CEO bowed in a ballroom, and a man who had been called the maintenance guy had simply said, hello, Richard, and let the room do the rest. And I think about that bow sometimes, and I think about what it costs to be underestimated for 3 years without letting it change who you are, and I think David is the most expensive person Lawrence ever dismissed for free, and he will not make that mistake again.